Joe woke to the smell of cooking meat and the sound of voices outside his guest quarters. For a moment, he couldn't place where he was. The bed was too comfortable, the air too still, the silence too complete. Then memory returned. Salt Town. The snake. The victory. He should be on a shuttle by now, heading to the next crisis. Instead, he'd sent a message to command last night requesting a brief extension. Debriefing and assessment of local security capabilities, he'd called it. The truth was simpler. His gut told him something wasn't finished here. Texas Knights learned to trust their guts. He dressed and stepped outside to find the town square transformed. Tables had been set up overnight, and what looked like half the population was gathered around them. At the center, mounted on a makeshift platform, was the snake's head, massive, terrible, and very, very dead. Mayor Beaumont spotted him and waved him over. Knight Mackenzie. Perfect timing. We've been butchering that beast for the last 12 hours. Preliminary tests say the meat's not just safe, it's delicious. We're about to have the first taste, and we figured the guest of honor should be present. Guest of honor, Joe repeated, adjusting his Stetson against the morning sun. You killed it. You saved 18,000 people. Damn right you're the guest of honor. Beaumont gestured to a seat that had been reserved at the head table. Come on, let's see if snake tastes as good as it looks. It did. The meat was firm but tender, with a flavor that reminded Joe of fish and chicken and something entirely new all at once. The locals had prepared it simply, salt, pepper, and heat, and it needed nothing more. This is incredible, Klein said, appearing at the table with a plate piled high. The young man's eyes were bright with excitement. Knight, do you know what this means? 2 million pounds of premium protein. That's months of food security right there. Not to mention what we can sell off-world. Weaver added, joining them. Exotic game, meat fetches premium prices. This could fund infrastructure improvements for years. Joe nodded, but his attention was elsewhere. He'd noticed Matthias and Sergeant Mueller in quiet conversation near the observation post, their expressions serious. Not the faces of men celebrating victory. Excuse me, gentlemen, Joe said, standing. I need to check on something. He found them studying a tactical display, fresh satellite data streaming across the screen. Matthias looked up as Joe approached, his weathered face grim. Knight Mackenzie, glad you're here. We've got a problem. Mueller pulled up an image dated from this morning, 3 hours ago, to be precise. Another furrow in the salt flats. Fresh. Maybe 40 miles southwest of town. Son of a bitch, Joe said quietly. There's more. Matthias highlighted several data points on the map. We've been analyzing the old tracking data, comparing it to the snake's behavior patterns. The attack sites were too widespread, the timing too inconsistent. We always assumed it was one snake moving fast, but you think there were multiple snakes, Joe finished. At least 3, Mueller confirmed. Maybe more. The territorial ranges overlap, but don't quite match. And look at this, he pulled up attack logs. 2 incidents on the same night, 80 miles apart. No way that's the same creature. Joe studied the data, his mind already shifting back into tactical mode. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Multiple predators, probably a family group, each with their own hunting grounds, but sharing the same general territory. How many do you think, he asked. Best guess? 4 to 6 total. We killed 1. The others are still out there. Joe thought about that, watching the morning sunlight paint the salt flats in shades of white and gold. He thought about his orders, about command's expectations, about the dozen other crises that probably needed night attention across the sector. Then he thought about Klein's excitement over engineering school, about the children who'd touched the snake's scales with wonder instead of fear, about Matthias's wife, who'd shyly asked Joe to sign a photograph for her daughter, about 3,000 people who'd just learned to hope again. All right, he said finally. Here's what we're going to do. Mayor Beaumont is already planning a celebration feast. Says he wants to invite everyone within 1,000 miles to share in the victory. We use that time to plan our next hunt. Matthias, I want you to pull together the same tracking data for all suspected snakes. Mueller, coordinate with the mining companies. See if we can borrow some of their survey equipment. Klein, already on it, the young man said, appearing as if summoned. I'm adapting the seismic sensors we used in the first hunt. Should be able to cover twice the range with better resolution. Joe allowed himself a small smile. You were listening in. It's a small town, Knight, and that observation post's walls aren't as thick as you'd think. Klein's expression turned serious. We learned a lot on that first hunt. We can do this. All of us together. I know you can, Joe said. But first, let's talk to the mayor about this feast. If we're going to do this right, We need to know what we're dealing with. And I have a feeling some of those ranchers and prospectors out on the edges might have seen things they haven't reported. 3 days later, the eastern salt flats looked like someone had transplanted a small city onto the desert. Nearly 4,000 people had responded to Beaumont's invitation, coming from mining operations and ranches and prospecting camps across 1,000 miles of territory. They arrived in mining haulers and personal transports, on horseback and on foot, setting up camps that turned the white expanse into a temporary metropolis. Joe spent those 3 days doing what knights did best, gathering intelligence and building relationships. He talked to ranchers who'd lost cattle to the snakes, listened to prospectors who'd seen strange tracks near remote dig sites, interviewed miners who swore they'd felt the ground shake in patterns that didn't match any known seismic activity. By the time the feast began at midnight, cool enough to be comfortable, with quantum-heated cooking pits making the massive quantities of snake meat smell like heaven, Joe had a much clearer picture of what they were facing. 4 snakes, maybe 5, each one claiming territory that ranged from 100 to 200 miles in diameter. The one they'd killed had been the most aggressive, the one that had pushed closest to town. The others were more cautious, sticking to the deep desert and the remote oases. But they were there, hunting, growing, threatening everything humanity had built on this planet. The feast itself was a marvel. The locals had erected a stage made from mining equipment, set up tables that stretched for what seemed like miles, and prepared the snake meat in a dozen different styles. Joe had shown them proper Texas barbecue technique, and the results were spectacular. Mayor Beaumont stood on the stage as the serving began, raising a glass of local whiskey. Friends, neighbors, and fellow frontiersmen. 3 weeks ago, we were living in fear. Today, we feast on that fear's flesh. The cheer that went up echoed across the flats, carrying for miles in the clear night air. We owe our lives to Knight Josiah Mackenzie, who came when we called and stood when we needed him most. To the night, 1,000 voices roared. Joe touched the brim of his Stetson, uncomfortable with the attention but honored nonetheless. Then Beaumont caught his eye and gave him a slight nod. Time for the real conversation. An hour into the feast, Joe found himself at a table with the leaders of the various remote operations. Ranchers, miners, company representatives, independent prospectors, the people who knew this planet better than anyone. Knight Mackenzie, said a weathered woman who ran a cattle operation near the western oases. Marie Ducasse. We met briefly when I arrived. I wanted to thank you for killing that monster, but I also wanted to tell you, we've got tracks near my ranch. Fresh ones. Whatever you killed wasn't alone. I know, Joe said. We've been piecing together the data. How fresh are these tracks? 2 days ago, my ranch hand Pierre saw something at dawn. Said it was moving through one of the lava tube openings about 15 miles from our main operation. Didn't get a good look, but he swears it was massive. Others chimed in with similar stories. A mining supervisor who'd lost a hauler to what he'd assumed was the same snake, but the timing didn't match. A prospector who'd found cattle kills with the same drained appearance, but hundreds of miles from any other attack site. We need to organize, Joe said, his voice carrying the weight of command. These snakes are smart, territorial, and dangerous, but they're also predictable. They use the lava tubes to move around, they hunt at night, and they avoid areas with heavy activity. If we work together, share information, coordinate patrols, track their movements, we can hunt them systematically. You're talking about another hunt, Ducasse said. How many volunteers did you have for the first one? 20 men. 20 men who learned how to fight these things, Joe corrected. 20 men who are now training others. And with what we learned from the first hunt, the next one should go faster. Safer. Should, someone muttered. Nothing's certain in war, Joe acknowledged. But I'll tell you what is certain, these snakes won't go away on their own. They'll keep hunting, keep growing, keep threatening everyone on this planet. We can hide from them and lose people one at a time, or we can face them head-on and end the threat permanently. He stood, his quantum spurs flaring slightly in the firelight. I'm going after the next snake tomorrow. Anyone who wants to join me is welcome. Anyone who wants to sit this one out, no judgment. But one way or another, we're going to make this planet safe. For a moment, there was only the crackle of the cooking fires and the distant sound of celebration. Then Ducasse stood. I'm in. Pierre can manage the ranch while I'm gone. Someone needs to kill the thing that's been eating my cattle. Others stood. A mining foreman. 2 prospectors. A company security officer. By the time the volunteers had finished stepping forward, Joe had 40 men and 3 women ready to hunt. Matthias appeared at his elbow, grinning. Looks like you've got yourself an army, Knight. I've got myself a posse, Joe corrected. A damn good one. The second snake took 2 weeks to track and kill. They followed it across 200 miles of salt flats and broken badlands, using the improved seismic sensors Klein had designed. The creature was smaller than the first, only about 1,500 feet, but meaner. It fought like it had something to protect, attacking aggressively even when retreat would have been smarter. That made Joe suspicious. Klein, he said during a brief rest stop. The posse gathered in the shadow of a rocky outcrop while the desert sun blazed overhead. Take 5 men and scout the secondary tunnels when we engage this thing. If it's protecting something, I want to know what. You think it's guarding a nest? Matthias asked. Or eggs, or young, or territory that matters for some reason. This snake's behavior doesn't match the first one. It's taking risks it shouldn't take. There's a reason for that. The final confrontation came in another lava tube system, this one with narrower passages and more vertical variation. The snake tried to use the terrain to its advantage, attempting to attack from above and below simultaneously. But the posse had learned from the first hunt. They worked together with the smooth efficiency of experienced hunters, driving the creature into a kill zone and pinning it with quantum lariats before Joe moved in with his sword. The blade bit deep into the snake's skull, guided by muscle memory and the quantum matrix's encoded experience. The creature thrashed once, twice, then went still. Nobody cheered this time. They were too professional for that now. Instead, they simply confirmed the kill and began the systematic search of the tunnel system. Klein found it an hour later. Knight Mackenzie. His voice crackled over the comm, tight with tension. You need to see this. Joe made his way through the tunnels to find Klein standing in a chamber that made his breath catch. Eggs. Dozens of them, each one the size of a hover car, arranged in a careful spiral pattern. The shells were translucent enough to show movement inside. Baby snakes, coiled and waiting to be born. Jesus, Matthias whispered, appearing beside Joe. How many? Klein was already counting, his portable scanner documenting everything. 37. All viable. If these had hatched, he didn't need to finish the thought. 37 more of these creatures, growing to full size, each one needing the same massive territory and food supply. The planet would have been overrun within a generation. Joe pulled out his comm and dialed the priority frequency for the Knight's Xenobiology division. He'd never used it before, but he'd been briefed on when it might be necessary. This is Knight Mackenzie, current location Salt Town, mining colony designation Delta 77. I need to speak to the Xenobiology division. Priority Alpha. The response came within minutes. Knight Mackenzie, what's the situation? I've got 37 viable eggs from an indigenous apex predator. Species unknown, approximately 1,500 to 2,000 feet at maturity. Eggs are in good condition, but will need immediate environmental management for study. Requesting science team for extraction. A pause, then, confirmed. We'll have a team there in 48 hours. Keep the eggs stable until then. And Knight, this could be significant. Unknown species of this size, with intact genetic material? That's a major discovery. Understood. Mackenzie out. He turned to find Klein and Matthias staring at him. They're going to take the eggs? Klein asked. Some of them. For study. To understand what we're dealing with. Joe looked at the spiral of translucent shells, seeing the shapes moving inside. These things nearly destroyed your colony. The more we know about them, the better we can protect other worlds if they show up elsewhere. Makes sense, Matthias said slowly. But it's strange, isn't it? We kill the adults and save the babies. Welcome to Frontier Conservation, Joe said with a slight smile. Come on, let's secure this chamber and get back to town. We've got 3 more snakes to find, and I want to do it before those eggs hatch, just in case our containment isn't as good as we think. They returned to Salt Town to find construction in progress. Joe noticed it from a distance, a new building going up at the edge of town, solid rammed earth construction in the local style. What's that? He asked Beaumont, who'd come out to meet the returning posse. The mayor's face split into a grin. That's yours. Joe blinked. Mine. You've been sleeping in guest quarters for 2 weeks, Knight. That's not right. A man who saved a planet twice deserves better. Beaumont gestured toward the structure. It's not fancy, but it's solid. Thick walls to keep out the heat, good ventilation, private quarters. We figured you might be staying a while longer, what with the other snakes still out there. Mayor, I can't. You already did. Soon as you stayed for that second hunt, you became one of us. And we take care of our own. Joe looked at the building, noting the careful craftsmanship, The way it matched the other earthen structures, but had subtle differences. Larger windows, a covered porch, details that spoke of care and thought. "Come see the best part," Matthias said, appearing with that mischievous grin Joe had learned to be wary of. They led him around to the entrance. Joe stopped dead. The snake's head, the first one he'd killed, had been mounted above the doorway. But not as it had been. They'd cleaned it, boiled it down to gleaming white bone, and positioned it so the massive skull seemed to be emerging from the wall itself. Jaws agape in a permanent silent roar. It was ridiculous. It was excessive. It was the most perfect thing Joe had ever seen. "Hell of a conversation starter," he managed. "Figured a knight needs a proper entrance," Matthias said. "Something that says, 'I kill things bigger than your house, and I'm not even sorry about it.'" "It definitely says that," Joe agreed. He looked at the house, his house, and felt something shift inside him. Something that had been tight and closed for years beginning to relax. "Thank you. All of you. Don't thank us yet," Beaumont said, his tone turning serious. "We've got fresh tracks reported near the northern oases. Another snake, probably. And the science team just confirmed they'll be here in 36 hours to collect those eggs. Think you're up for coordinating both?" Joe looked at the skull above his door, then at the men who'd become his brothers in arms over the past weeks. He thought about his orders, about command's expectations, about all the reasons he should already be gone. Then he thought about the house with the skull over the door, about a community that built homes for knights who stayed, about teaching Klein and the others everything he knew, passing on 300 years of Texas tradition to people who'd earned the right to learn it. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'm up for it." The third snake was found 6 days later, after the science team had arrived and begun their work with the eggs. Dr. Henrik Castellane, the lead researcher, was a nervous man who spoke in technical jargon and seemed perpetually worried that someone was going to damage his precious specimens. Joe liked him anyway. Anyone that passionate about understanding alien life deserved respect, even if he drove everyone else crazy with his constant warnings about proper environmental controls. "These eggs are remarkable," Castellane said, showing Joe detailed scans of the developing embryos. "The growth rate is accelerated compared to Earth snakes of similar size. We're estimating they would have hatched in another 2 months. The venom glands are already forming, and the digestive system is adapted for consuming prey much larger than themselves." "How much larger?" Joe asked. "Based on these scans, an adult could swallow something the size of a mining tank and digest it completely within a week." The stomach acid alone. He caught Joe's expression and coughed. "Right. Too much information. The point is, these are apex predators perfectly adapted to this environment. We're fortunate you found them before they hatched." The third snake was spotted by Marie Ducasse's ranch hand, the same Pierre who'd reported earlier tracks. This time he got a better look, and it scared him enough that he rode straight to Salt Town without stopping, his horse nearly dead from exhaustion. "It's big," he told Joe, still breathing hard from the ride. "Bigger than anything should be. And it was hunting, deliberately, like it was tracking something." "Tracking what?" Joe asked. "Me. I swear it was following my scent. I only got away because I made it to the surface before it could corner me underground." That was new information. The first 2 snakes had been ambush predators, striking from concealment. If this one was actively hunting humans. "How long ago?" Joe asked. 12 hours. Maybe less. Joe looked at Matthias, who was already nodding. "I'll get the posse together. We can be moving in an hour." "Make it 30 minutes, Joe said. "If this one's actively hunting, we can't give it time to adapt. We need to hit it hard and fast." The third hunt took 10 days, and it taught them more about the snake's intelligence than the first 2 combined. The creature laid ambushes, doubled back on its own trail, and even attempted to separate members of the posse from the main group. It was learning from the deaths of its kin, adapting its tactics. But the posse was learning too. They moved in tight formations, used drones for scouting, and never let themselves be drawn into vulnerable positions. When they finally cornered it in a deep lava tube system, they executed the kill with professional efficiency. No heroics, no dramatic last stands. Just good tactics, better training, and the kind of teamwork that only came from shared experience. "We're getting good at this," Klein said afterward, checking his equipment. The young man had taken naturally to the technical aspects of snake hunting, and his innovations with the seismic sensors had probably saved a dozen lives. "We are," Joe agreed. "But don't get cocky. These things are smart, and they're learning too. Every snake we face is going to be harder than the last." He was right. The fourth snake was found 2 weeks later, and it proved to be the most difficult yet. This one had learned to use the lava tubes defensively, collapsing sections behind it as it retreated, forcing the posse to dig through rubble or find alternate routes. The hunt stretched from days into weeks, a grinding campaign of tracking and counter-tracking across hundreds of miles of desert. They lost their first person since Fisher and Bergeron, a miner named Guillaume who got separated from his squad during a tunnel collapse. They found his body 3 days later, drained dry like all the snake's victims. Joe wrote the letter to Guillaume's family himself, sitting in his house with the skull watching over him, trying to find words that would make sense of the senseless. The fifth snake took 3 weeks to track down. It had gone deep, using tunnel systems that weren't on any survey maps, avoiding all the areas where humans had active operations. They only found it because Klein developed a new passive sonar system that could detect movement through solid rock. By the time they killed it, the posse had swelled to 50 permanent members, with rotating shifts and specialized roles. Matthias led the trackers. Klein managed technical operations. Weaver commanded the heavy weapons teams. Marie Ducasse had taken charge of logistics, ensuring the far-ranging hunts never ran out of supplies. They were becoming an army. Or, more accurately, they were becoming rangers, the kind of frontier defense force that Texas had pioneered centuries ago, adapted for a new world with new threats. The sixth snake was killed a month after Joe first arrived on the planet. The science team had already departed with most of the eggs, leaving behind detailed instructions for monitoring the 3 that Joe had kept. For local study, he'd told Dr. Castellane. Just in case. The truth was simpler. He wanted to understand these creatures, not just kill them. There was a difference between eliminating a threat and destroying an ecosystem. Texas Knights had always known that. After the 6th kill, Joe sat on the porch of his house and watched the sun set over the salt flats. His comm unit showed messages from command, not urgent, but present. A dimensional incursion on New Valencia. Machine intelligence problems on Kepler 442b. The usual galaxy-spanning chaos that Knights existed to handle. He should respond. Should tell them he'd be moving on soon, that the situation here was under control. Instead, he found himself drafting a very different message. Command, this is Knight Mackenzie. Current deployment extended successfully. Local security force now capable of handling indigenous predator threats with minimal Knight supervision. However, recommend establishing permanent Knight presence in Delta Sector for training and crisis response coordination. Request authorization to establish first Knight's outpost on Salt Town. Advise. He stared at the message for a long time before hitting send. The response came 3 days later, while Joe was helping Klein train a new batch of recruits in proper lava tube tactics. Knight Mackenzie, your request is approved. The Republic recognizes the value of permanent Knight presence in developing sectors. You are authorized to establish outpost, recruit and train local security forces, and coordinate crisis response for Delta Sector. Salary and support unchanged. 2 additional Knights will be assigned to your command within 6 months. Congratulations on your new assignment. Joe read the message twice, then looked around at the training ground, at Klein demonstrating seismic sensor placement, at Matthias teaching tracking skills, at Weaver showing proper formation tactics, at the community that had become his home without him quite noticing when it happened. Something wrong? Matthias asked, appearing at his elbow. No, Joe said slowly. Something's very right. How'd you like to be part of the first official Knight's outpost in this sector? Matthias's grin could have lit the salt flats at midnight. Does that mean you're staying? Joe looked at his house, at the skull above the door, at the salt flats stretching to infinity under the setting sun. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I think I am. The pattern continued. Reports came in of a 7th snake, this one operating near the eastern mining operations. The posse, now officially designated the Salt Flats Rangers, mobilized with practiced efficiency. Joe led them personally, but he noticed he was doing less direct commanding and more teaching. Matthias made tactical decisions. Klein solved technical problems. Marie Ducasse managed logistics so smoothly that supplies appeared almost before they were needed. They were becoming self-sufficient, learning to protect themselves. That was the goal, Joe reminded himself. Knights weren't conquerors or rulers. They were teachers, protectors, the ones who stood in the gap until the locals could stand for themselves. But it was strange, watching them grow independent. Like raising children, he supposed, though he'd never had any of his own. The 7th snake fell after 2 weeks of careful hunting. The Rangers executed the kill with such efficiency that Joe barely needed to intervene. His sword stayed sheathed. His spurs remained dim. They'd learned everything he could teach them about fighting these creatures. "We're ready," Matthias said afterward, as they stood over the dead snake in the cool darkness of the lava tubes. "Aren't we? Ready to do this without you." "You've been ready for a while," Joe admitted. "But that doesn't mean I'm leaving. Being ready to fight alone doesn't mean you should fight alone. That's the whole point of the outpost." "So you'll stay? Even when we don't need you?" Joe smiled. "Matthias, needing and wanting are different things. You don't need me to kill snakes anymore. But maybe you want someone around who's done this before. Someone who can train the next generation, who can call for help when something worse than snakes shows up, who can be part of the community," Matthias finished. "Not just passing through, but actually staying. Actually giving a damn." "Yeah," Joe said. "That." They stood in silence for a moment, then began the familiar process of documenting the kill and preparing to haul the head to the surface. The Rangers worked around them, efficient and professional, no longer the desperate volunteers who'd followed Joe into the dark 2 months ago. Above them, through cracks in the rock, starlight filtered down. Somewhere up there, the galaxy spun on, full of crises and chaos and battles that needed fighting. But down here, in the darkness under the salt flats, Joe Mackenzie had found something more important than another mission. He'd found home. The 8th snake was reported 3 weeks later. By then, the Rangers had established a proper headquarters in Salt Town, a complex of earthen buildings that included barracks, training facilities, and a command center that would make any military installation proud. Joe's house stood at the center of it all, the skull above the door a permanent reminder of what they were fighting. Klein had been accepted to an engineering program at the Republic's Technical University on New Austin. He'd be leaving in 3 months, but in the meantime, he was training his replacement and developing equipment designs that could be manufactured locally. "I'll come back," he told Joe one evening, as they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. "After I get my degree. Help you build this place into something that lasts." "I'd like that," Joe said honestly. The 8th snake took a week to kill. The Rangers barely needed Joe's input. They developed their own tactics, adapted to the terrain, learned to read the signs as well as any tracker he'd ever worked with. The 9th snake was found and killed 2 weeks after that. This time, Joe stayed in Salt Town, monitoring the operation remotely and only intervening to offer advice when asked. Marie Ducasse led the hunt, and she did it with the kind of cool competence that would have made any veteran knight proud. "We're done," she reported when they returned. "That's 9 confirmed kills, 1 clutch of eggs secured. No new tracks reported in the last month. I think we got them all." "Maybe," Joe said. "Or maybe the survivors have learned to avoid us. Either way, the immediate threat is contained." That night, Salt Town threw another celebration, smaller than the first great feast, more intimate. The Rangers gathered in the courtyard outside Joe's house, sharing drinks and stories and the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from a job well done. Dr. Laurent appeared with her daughter Emma, who immediately demanded that Joe look at her latest drawings. He did, admiring her interpretation of the salt flats and the Rangers and the giant snakes that no longer frightened her. "She wants to be a ranger when she grows up," Dr. Laurent said, watching her daughter with a mix of pride and concern. "Says she wants to be like you." "Could do worse," Joe said. Then, realizing how that sounded, I know what you meant." She smiled. "You're staying, aren't you? Not just for now. Really staying." Joe looked around at the celebration, at the people who'd become family, at the house with the skull above the door that somehow felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived in 20 years. "Yeah," he said. "I think I really am." The 10th snake was spotted 6 weeks later, near the southern Badlands. The Rangers mobilized immediately, but this time something felt different. The tracks were smaller, the pattern of movement less aggressive. When they finally cornered it, they found a juvenile, maybe 800 feet long, still learning to hunt, probably separated from its parent during the earlier kills. "We could relocate it," Klein suggested. "I've been working with Dr. Castellane's team. They've identified some uninhabited regions 300 miles south that might support a small population without threatening human operations." "Relocate a giant snake," Weaver said slowly. "That's crazy," Matthias finished. "But possibly brilliant. These things are native to this planet. We're the invaders, really, if we can learn to coexist." They looked at Joe, waiting for his decision. He thought about it. About the difference between eliminating threats and preserving ecosystems. About the 3 eggs still in stasis below the outpost. Insurance against the day when humanity might need to understand these creatures better. "Do it," he said finally. "But carefully. and we monitor the relocated snake for 6 months minimum. First sign it's moving back toward inhabited areas, we put it down. Agreed. Agreed, Klein said, already pulling up maps and planning routes. They spent the next week carefully herding the juvenile snake away from human territory, using drones and seismic charges to guide it into the uninhabited regions. It was delicate work, requiring more finesse than any of their previous hunts. When it was done, when the snake had settled into new territory far from anything human, Joe sat in his house and filed his report to command. He detailed the 10 kills, the egg discovery, the establishment of the rangers, and the decision to relocate the last snake rather than kill it. The response came from Colonel Brooks, his old commanding officer. Knight Mackenzie, your work on Salt Town has exceeded all expectations. The Republic recognizes your outpost as the model for future frontier defense. 2 additional knights will arrive next month as planned. Well done, and welcome to permanent assignment. Joe leaned back in his chair, watching the evening light paint the salt flats in shades of gold. His quantum spurs hummed softly at his feet, charged but dormant. His sword hung on the wall, still deadly but no longer in constant use. Through the window, he could see rangers training in the courtyard. Klein was teaching a class on seismic sensor operation. Matthias was leading a tracking exercise. Marie Ducasse was coordinating with newly arrived ranchers about establishing early warning systems around their operations. The galaxy still spun on, full of crises and chaos. But here, on this salt-flat planet that had called for help 2 months ago, something new was being built. Something that would last. Joe's comm unit buzzed. Dr. Laurent, asking if he wanted to join her and Emma for dinner. He smiled and typed his response. I'll bring the beer. The eyes of Texas, after all, were always watching. And sometimes, just sometimes, they decided to stay.
Many thanks to channel member Caleb Fast for making this video possible. And thank you to all my other channel members and Pathfinders as well. You all keep this channel going. If you'd like to become a member, please be sure to do so and gain access to some awesome exclusive perks. Everyone else, thank you for listening to this story, and I do hope that you enjoyed it. Please be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon to see more videos like this, and be sure to leave this video a like, too. Channel memberships, super thanks, merch purchases, and even book purchases, our links to our books are in the description section below, are a great way to keep this channel going, and they help us afford to make better videos too. Partner with us as we grow into one of the best sci-fi channels on YouTube and beyond. With all of that said, thank you again for listening to this story, and I hope to see you again. Thank you for your time, and be sure to check out the story and playlist on the left side of your screen now. I'll see you in the next one.